Okay, good morning and Happy New Year from the Audit Committee. Roll call, please.
Richard Correll,
Present.
Audit Member Ed Kachadurian,
Here.
Audit Member Tom O'Shaughnessy,
Present.
Audit Member Alex Barahon,
Present.
and Chair Zari Amirian.
I am here. Let's move on to the business agenda, please.
The agenda for today's Audit Committee meeting of January 23rd, 2017 was posted on Thursday, January 19th, 2017 on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Thank you. Oral communications, I do not have any cards in front of me. And so we will move on to item number 4, please.
Item number 4 is approval of minutes. Minutes of the Audit Committee meeting held on Monday, July 25th, 2016.
Okay. It has been a while.
Move adoption.
Second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Audit Member Richard Correll,
So moved.
Ed
I'm
Kachad,
I'm sorry, I think you're intending to abstain because you were not present at that meeting?
Good call, thank you.
Audit Member Ed Kachadurian,
Yes.
Audit Member Tom O'Shaughnessy,
Affirmative.
Audit Member Alex Barahon,
Approved.
and Chair Zari Amirian.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to item number 5, please.
Item number 5, action items, and there are no items.
Okay, number 6, please.
Number 6 is reports information. A, internal audit activity report as of December 31st, 2016. Eileen Donahue, Internal Audit Manager.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Audit Committee members. I'd like to go through our internal audit activity report as of December 31st. As you will see, we have completed projects. That's what we go through at first. We had one audit that was issued in November 2016. It was a limited review of grant administration within the public safety departments. This was an audit that was on our audit work plan, and it was actually suggested by the Director of Finance. And what we are looking at, we were looking for good practice management of grants. And when we initiated this audit, we expected that our findings would be going to the public safety departments. But once I looked at good practice criteria and looked at Government Finance Officers Association suggested good practices for managing grants, I realized what we really were missing were a centralized oversight function and also a centralized database, a central collection agency for monitoring reports, and robust grant policies. Our grant policies had been written back in the late 1990s and weren't fully inclusive. And so of the five observations, 4 of them actually were directed to the Department of Finance. And so Finance is aware that they need to build up their department to provide better oversight to help the other departments that are managing grants to do it more efficiently and effectively. There was one observation that was jointly written to the fire department and the police department, and it was just suggestions to increase their practices associated with their grants. The second audit that we had was the storage tank audit, and this was done under attorney-client privilege and was not made public. The third audit that we actually issued in December was one that we actually also withdrew after we issued it. It was looking at the fees that were associated with the marketplace parking agreements, but then after we issued the audit, we were informed of additional information associated that we didn't know going into it that was communicated to the Public Works Management, and so we withdrew that audit and we're doing additional work before reissuing it. Moving forward, we have 6 projects in process right now. One is very close to finalizing the report. That's the record management audit, and I expect you'll be seeing that report within the next 2 months. We also are very close to issuing a report or starting the report writing phase for the Fleet Faster System audit. So you'll be seeing reports coming out soon. As well, every quarter we do audit follow-up, and I'm proud to report that at the end of December, we only had 14 outstanding audit issues associated with 4 of our audit projects. Last quarter, we had 24 outstanding audit issues. We added 5 because of the grant audit, and now we're down to 14 that are outstanding. Also, I'm happy to report that we have no outstanding priority 1 audit issues, which are the ones that we consider to be more risk, and those have all been closed as of today. Moving into the next section of this activity report, we also bring to your attention any outstanding audit issues that meet certain criteria that were addressed through a resolution within the audit committee. And that is if an audit observation has moved to not implemented, or an audit observation hasn't been fully satisfied within 2 years or within 3 years. And we actually have 4 of those to address with you today, and we have representatives from the departments where those reports were issued. The first one is the mobile device operational audit. This is where a policy hasn't been updated for the wireless communications. And you might remember this was one that had met the 2-year mark back in June, and the director wasn't available to meet with you. He's here today, and you'll see that we actually changed this one to not implemented, and that doesn't mean he's not going to be implementing a policy. It's just likely he won't be doing it within the 3 years of the time that we look at it. And so he's going to give you a status update on where he's at with that policy as of right now. So if I could ask Brian Ganley to address you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee.
Good morning.
I'm Brian Ganley, the Chief Information Officer for the city. I'm here to discuss the mobile device operational audit. While we have not finalized a policy yet, we have made a great deal of progress since that audit was completed in several different areas. Shortly after that audit was completed, we implemented a pilot project to do cell phone stipends for certain categories of employees, moving them off of city-provided cellular devices onto their personal devices. We're in the process of expanding that to a larger scope of employees within the organization. In addition to that, we're working on the various issues internally when we provide cell phone devices or allow connectivity from personal cell phone devices from employees in different bargaining units and under different FLSA categorizations. So as we finalize all of those policies and procedures, which have all been making progress during this period, we would expect to be able to finalize that policy.
What's the timeline? What do you think the timeline's going to be in terms of getting that done?
Mr. Chair, I think that the timeline would be within the next year.
Okay. Any further questions?
I'm just curious what is it because of the changes in Verizon, AT&T, Metro PCS and everything that has taken this long, or is it FCC related? I have a ham radio license, so I'm curious if it's government regulations that are in a changing government sense, so you have to keep modifying our response to be in line with them, or is it just a tough nut to crack?
Excellent question. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. It's really internal procedural issues in quite a few areas. The one that comes closest to, I think, what you're asking is we are in the process of switching every city-owned device over from Android to iPhone. That's a major effort that is taking a lot of time of the same staff that would be working on this policy. We're doing that for security reasons, application compatibility, several other policy and technical issues. So we are making progress in several technical and policy areas internally that will allow us to write a better policy. Had we developed a policy on the timeline that we're on now, and if I had met this goal, it would have needed to have been revised a number of times over the next time period anyway, which is why we've gone a little bit slower as we develop all these policies and procedures internally.
Thank you.
A question for you.
And what's the financial impact on this in regards to the switch from the Android to the iPhone? In regards to, you know, changing all the handheld devices, obviously, and the infrastructure related to all this?
Excellent question, thank you. Perhaps there is a small financial cost in acquiring iPhones. The city does use a contract that is a statewide contract with Verizon as our primary provider. We get a great deal that it's just impossible for consumers to get. So the cost is very minimal. And then on the back end, you have to consider the cost of staff time. One of the issues that we dealt with in Android phone support is each model of Android is different from each other model. So our user base with the phones had to become accustomed to a different way of doing it than their last phone. And our support staff in ISD had to be able to familiarize themselves with several different phones running different software. The advantage to Apple devices is that they're homogeneous. One way that works on an iPhone or an iPad works on every other iPhone and iPad, and there's significant support savings there, which is one of the main reasons that we thought the switch was warranted.
Are there opportunities for people who already have iPhones to continue using their iPhones, or they all have to use one that's issued by the city?
Excellent question, thank you. Yes, people with iPhones, if they're part of the stipend program and they're able to use a personal device for their city email, etc., absolutely. We are doing this on a progressive measure. We're not just wholesale recalling all of the Android phones. Phones would typically last 2 years per the cell phone agreements. So we are doing this over that time span rather than just recall everything all at once. We don't have the staff power to do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The next item is actually from the audit that we issued in November. It's associated with the dedicated centralized grant oversight function, and we directed it towards Department of Finance. And although Department of Finance understands how important it is to have a centralized oversight function, they also realize that this is going to be a long-term strategic goal. It's going to require approvals through the city manager's office and I believe through city council. And so they've made progressive steps to establish this strategic goal, but we've changed it to not implement it because it's going to be very long-term over several years. If you want, I would guess Bob could.
I'm here if you want to ask questions, clearly.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
You talk about it's going to take a long time to implement. You talking about the implementation of the department itself, to hire the staffing to be able to, in order to oversee the actual grant budget related to specific grants, or is it some other delays that are associated with it?
I don't know if there's any specific issue. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, excuse me. It's been a long-term goal of ours to have a dedicated revenue section, which we have gone through probably a year and a half in terms of reorganizing a portion of our department. We have that now. My goal is to have a centralized grants management. Previously in the city, it has not been. Every department kind of does its own. So over time, we want to get that centralized so we have better management of it. And excuse me. Ultimately have better tools in which to make sure we get drawdowns done timely, et cetera.
And that's even though this one was for the public safety departments, I mean, that's true for the entire city, right? There isn't
Correct.
any
Yeah.
centralized.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember my days on the Community Development Block Grant Committee and kind of dealing with city projects versus non-city projects. And I remember thinking it would help if there was one person or a group of people who kind of handled all of the city projects so that the voice was the same, and somebody who had an idea of what was going on across all departments and could align that with, you know, what the city manager and the city council wanted. So that's good to hear. Any other questions on that?
When I read the 12 pages again this morning, It was an interesting breakfast item for me. The two things that stood out was the assembly of updates quarterly, and I'm curious if the various grant administrators in the different departments and in public safety, do they continuously forward copies of their correspondence between themselves, or is it only assembled on a quarterly basis?
It's piecemeal, I would say, at best at this point, and that's one of the goals, is to make sure that there's a constant information flow between the lead department and finance, so we're in the loop. Oftentimes, a department will run off, get a grant. Half the time, we're not even aware of it. So it's really just improving that information flow.
And if I noticed correctly in going through some of the highlights about manual paper forms and retrieval of things, are we trying to reach a Star Trek moment where a whole lot more is done on handheld and then just uploaded that way?
We'd love to go paperless, so that's probably far-fetched at this point. Yeah, I mean, really, it's just increasing that information flow depending on the grantee or the grantor agency. Sometimes it's various departments of the federal government, various departments of the state government, the county, various agencies in between. So it really depends on what they need versus what we have to give them, whether it's electronic or paper. So as much as we'd like to go electronic, I don't see that happening in the near future, but we can always give it a shot.
Thank you.
So, quick question. You hit upon really the central issue, which is at the end of the day, there's sort of two sets of activities and two sets of needs. One is the grantor and what they require to remain in compliance, to continue either giving the money or be in good standing for the next time that you apply for the money. The second thing is the needs of the city. And sometimes the information that the grantee is required to submit is helpful for the city. Sometimes there's information that is being collected that is not necessarily helpful, or there's information that is not being collected at all that the city would like to know. I think that one of the challenges is not reinventing the wheel, right? So making sure that you leverage the existing activities that are already happening in terms of the grantor-grantee relationship, because people are busy and they don't want to have to do more than they're already doing. But the other thing that I would recommend is that if you're engaging in this activity already, you're one step closer to actually beginning to think strategically about outcomes and evaluation, right? So not just are the grantees doing what they're supposed to do, but one step further, what is the impact of this money through the program and then in general for the city benefits? So I'd love to continue this conversation offline because if you're already doing this work, it's just one step closer, or a few more steps closer towards discussing evaluation and impact. And I know the city has a strategic plan, so I'm assuming that there would be alignment there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I just have one question, Robert, and I'm just trying to get this into my head as to, I'm assuming the departments like the fire or police actually get reports of what is still remaining in that particular grant. So, I saw where in the fiscal year 13 and 14, there were unutilized amount of $98,000 and $424,000. So, I know they want to purchase all these stuff, so I'm just curious as to, are the departments aware that they had this, or is it oversight or something?
It does happen where they recognize that they have additional monies at the end, but they also have to work within their department and what are their department needs, and sometimes there's strict requirements associated with the money, and so that they don't want to just go out and buy equipment that they can't keep using in the future, and so sometimes they do let the money lapse, but they do try to use it to the best of their ability.
I guess I would say there's lots of strings attached to grants, and sometimes you just can't hook them up and meet the needs that that the grant money was for. So oftentimes they just can't utilize it all.
The one benefit is the one grant program that they do get on an annual basis. They were stuck to very short time requirements, like 9 months from the time it was awarded and that they had to expend it by. And that time period has been extended now for the grants in the future. And so they'll have more time available to them to do the procurement and to utilize the grant funds.
Just a quick question for me. The centralized grant oversight would be mainly a financial oversight. So in terms of like, what the lead department does in terms of the overall performance, just like the question was asked, do you think it's the best way to kind of house this position within the finance department, or?
Yes, I do, actually, and that's the goal, is we have a revenue manager within finance in the revenue section. And part of our long-term goal, and that's why we had no revenue section years ago, and we put it together, got the last personnel piece right before the end of the year to actually create this section. And that's one of the charges that they will have is better centralized grant management, and not necessarily, first line, but kind of in the background where the departments will still be the lead liaison with the granting agency. But we just want to make sure that as the grants come in, we're aware of them, how they're managed, we get the drawdowns, the requirements are met if possible. We would prefer not to leave money on the table, so help to facilitate any of those issues.
So could you also help us understand what is the process right now? So there's somebody at the finance department, every lead department submits requests for the drawdown, or like how does that work?
It depends. A typical, if it's a federal grant, most likely we just get the check. If it's a UOSI or a Homeland Security grant that the police department gets, oftentimes you'll go out and spend the money and then fill out the paperwork and get the money. It's a reimbursement type grant. It really depends on the granting agency.
So I guess my question is that the request always comes from the lead department for
Correct.
the okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
And just one more question from me, just so that we have an understanding and that there's a kind of a general understanding. What's the scope of grant monies, or what's the ratio in terms of the amount of revenue that the city brings in? What percentage do grant monies represent?
Oh, on an annual basis, maybe 10%. It's a chunk.
Yeah.
It's a chunk of money. I don't know what, Sujin, what was the single audit total? 50 million? 40 million? I mean, we've spent as high as maybe 80 million.
Okay.
But it really depends on what's available.
Great. Thank you. Next.
Okay. As well, we have two other issues that were part of the report, Building Safety Division Inspection Audit, that have met the 2-year mark. These are two outstanding issues. And we have with us, Jan Edwards of Community Development with us, and we also have Brian Ganley, because both of these issues are associated where they are coordinating, the department was coordinating with Information Services to accomplish these observations. So I'm going to let Brian Ganley come up and talk over both of them.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, hello again. I'm speaking on these items on behalf of Mr. Lanzafame and Ms. Edwards because, as Ms. Donahue said, these are largely technology-type projects. On issue number 2, the inefficiencies and manual paper forms, I'm happy to report tremendous progress over just the last few months in bringing several systems online that address this issue, including an online inspection portal for our contractors and customers to use. More recently, we're issuing iPads to our field staff so that they can do inspections completely in the field, completely paperless. And then finally, we're just now launching an online permit renewal, and eventually to be expanded to permit issuance, all online. So all of those things, I think, address what this issue comments on, and arguably could be considered completed, but these things are being rolled out more or less as we speak. So these are about to be finalized, I would say, in all of those areas. Tremendous progress, took a great deal of work from ISD staff, working with community development staff, and our vendor.
A question for you. So as part of this being out in the field and being paperless, are you using something which, as a comparison, might be Dropboxes or Google Doc sharing where it's loaded up but other people in the department can access from inside the office while the person's still out in the field?
Yes, we are using the application that we use for permitting in the field live through a cellular connection, Verizon, as we discussed earlier. So this is part of that. This will be part of the mobile device policy as well. So in the field, they're using real data and they're submitting real data real time that would be accessible by the public through the portals as well as any of the other staff in the office.
Thank you.
Okay, next issue. Issue number 12.
On issue number 12, that has not yet been completed. That's a fairly minor issue compared to the issue that I just discussed. And it's really a matter of, in collaboration with ISD and community development staff, we develop a priority list of which items can we fix or improve in our permitting system that will provide the most efficiency. And almost all of our resources have been focused on issue number 2 and several other items that were not part of this audit. So this remains on our punch list. It will be completed. Again, in collaboration with the department, we determine where should we put those resources for the most efficiency. And we have a few other items that are still a little bit higher on the list than this one.
Question for you. So with this new paper flow that you guys are obviously making more things efficient in the department, does this result in any reduction of staffing in your department, which will save some funds?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I don't believe that that is the plan. Again, speaking for Mr. Lanzafame, but I think the goal is improved customer service, reducing timelines, doing more with less, reducing some of that overload that the department faces through using technology for greater efficiency.
When you list under the part on current status, you mentioned that identifying permits with an incorrect expired status and approximately 300 have been researched and updated to the correct status. How many more of them are there to be updated?
To the best of my knowledge, this part of the finding may have been completed. I think the part that remains is modifying the permitting system to allow that finalization to be done in the way that it describes here, and we need our third-party vendors' software update in order to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That completes our project update.
Mr. Chairman, I just had one extra question, if I may.
Go ahead.
This is in regards to the completed project, the storage tank audit. I know that it says it's an attorney-client privilege, but I had just a quick question. From what I understand, the report is generated by the city and submitted to the state water board. Is it? Is that? Can we?
I can answer that question. It's a report that was requested by the city attorney's office for the auditor to complete, so it doesn't go to the state water board. It actually comes back to our office.
Oh, okay, but like we are generating this as part of a lawsuit, as I understand. This was like back in 2014. Is that it? And my question basically.
No, they're not connected. The
They're not
request, there was an issue as it relates to the water board some years ago, but the internal audit was requested by the city attorney's office to review our operations.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to 6B.
Number 6B is Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, the CAFR, and report to the Audit Committee from Vavrinic Tri Day and Company, LLP. Sujin Lee, Accounting Manager.
Good morning, Chair Miriam and committee members. My name is Shujing Lee. I'm the accounting manager in the finance department. And today I'm here to present you the city's comprehensive annual financial report, in short CAFR, for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2016. I will talk about the timeline of the CAFR preparation, the CAFR structure, and the single audit report, and the audit result, and the Governmental Accounting Standards Board pronouncements, and the cash balances. At the end, I will invite Mr. David Showalter, who is the engagement partner from the city's external auditor firm, Revenue Tri-Day and Company, in short, VTD. He will do his required communication to you. And at the end, we'll be happy to take any questions you may have. First, let me walk you through for the timeline of the CAFR preparation. So for the fiscal year 2016 audit, VTD staff came to the city to do their preliminary field work in the first 2 weeks of May. And then they come back again in the last week of August to do the single audit major grants testing. In the same week, confirmation letters were sent out. And on the other hand, from July to October 2016, the accounting staff worked on closing the book of June, accrue all the revenues and expenses, process all the year-end related transactions, and prepare CAFR Draft 1. In the middle of October, the CAFR Draft 1 was completed, and the VTD staff came back again at that time to do more testing work and also review the CAFR. So between the middle of October to the end of November, there were constant communication between the city and the VTD staff about the CAFR, and during that time, 2 more drafts of the CAFR were prepared and reviewed. And the CAFR was finally completed at the end of November when VTD issued their opinion letter. And then at the beginning of December, we worked with graphics to print the CAFR. And then also we presented the CAFR to the council on December 13. Next, I'm going to give you an overview of the CAFR structure. The CAFR has 3 sections: introductory, financial, and statistical. The introductory section includes a transmittal letter prepared by the Director of Finance, the city officials, and the orchard of the city. The financial section includes the auditor's opinion letter, the management discussion and analysis, and also all the fund financial statements, the notes, and also the supplementary information. The management's discussion and analysis, in short MD&A, is like the executive summary of the CAFR. It provides all the financial highlights of the cities and includes all the summary of the city's debt and the bond ratings. And in the CAFR, all the fund financial statements are presented in a top-down sequence. At the very beginning, the most consolidated government-wide statements are presented. And then it's the major fund financial statements, and then it's the non-major fund financial statements, and then it's the internal service funds. The city has in total more than 60 funds, and then major funds by definition is the funds that have more significant transactions than the non-major funds. For example, general fund, electric fund, and water fund. And then the internal service funds are used by the city to centralize certain city services and then allocate the cost of those services to the user departments, such as like fleet and insurance funds. And then the notes and the required supplemental information just provide the readers in more details about the city's financials. And the last section of the CAFR is the statistical section, which provides 21 schedules in about 5 categories. And most of these schedules have 10 years of information. So it provides the readers very useful information like the financial trends and the operation information. And the next 2 slides, I'm going to give you a snapshot of the city's financials. Slide number 9 shows the city's statement of net position, which is the balance sheet. So as you can see, as of June 30, 2016, the city has almost $1.5 billion in net position. And slide number 10 shows the statement of the activities, which like the income statement. In fiscal year 2016, the city has an increase of $253 million increase in the net position. And next, I'm very happy to tell you that the city received an unmodified opinion for the city's CAFR, which is the best opinion an entity can receive. And we also received an unmodified opinion for the city's single audit report. Single audit report is required for government agencies who spend more than $750,000 in direct and pass-through federal grants. And again, the city didn't receive any finding for any of the federal grants. And next, I want to talk about a little bit about the Governmental Accounting Standards Board pronouncements. GASB stands for Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which sets all the accounting rules that government agencies have to follow. In fiscal year 2016, there were no major GASB implementations, but there's one I would like to mention here that we will need to implement in about 2 years, which is GASB 75. GASB 75 is the accounting and financial reporting for post-employment benefits other than pensions, OPEB. Currently, in our CAFR, we just need to disclose the city's net OPEB obligation in the footnotes. But in 2018, when we implement GASB 75, we will have to record this obligation in the city's financial statements, which will certainly decrease the city's net position. And in October 2015, the council actually unblended the active and retired with employees' medical insurance premium rates, which dramatically reduced the net OPEB liability from $240 million to $21 million. And this council action has prepared the city in a very good position to implement GASB 75 in fiscal year 2018. And last is the cash balances of all the city funds. As of June 30, 2016, you can see the general fund has over $94 million in cash, and overall the total city has more than $678 million in cash. And next, I'm going to invite Mr. David Showalter to come here to do his presentation to you. I'll be happy to take any questions you may have at the end.
While David's coming up to the podium, it's important to note on that cash balances, if you recall from prior years, our water fund has been significantly negative for many, many years, and I'm happy to say it's now positive once again. So impact of belt tightening and some of the rate increases that were put in place that has helped that fund out dramatically.
And can you just briefly go over the council action to unblend
Sure.
the active and retired employees and why that had such a significant impact on the net OPEB liability?
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, there were two significant GASB pronouncements, GASB 68 and GASB 75. 68 has already been implemented, and that's where we book our net pension liability, which had significant impacts to the city's net position. Knowing there's not a lot we can do about our pension liability, that's all administered by PERS. However, OPEB, the other post-employment benefits, which basically encapsulates everything outside of pensions, which is health and life insurance and any other post-retirement benefit there may be. The city had a long-standing practice of blending its insurance rates with retirees that stayed on our plan. The result was created what's known as an implied subsidy. There's a benefit to current employees for that future benefit. And what GASB had in GASB 45 basically said you have to disclose what that benefit is and what that liability, that pending future liability is. What GASB 75 will do, and it takes it a step further, is you have to identify that liability, but you also have to book it. So up until GASB 75, there really is no balance sheet impact. You're just saying to the world how much you have out there in terms of OPEB liability. But knowing that there was an ability to do something about it, we looked for several years how we could better manage our OPEB liability, and the best solution was to unblend the rates. The result was, as you can see, it lowered the OPEB liability by about 90% through that unblending. So that implied subsidy for that future benefit is no longer there.
So does that have any other, the $200 million reduction in net liability in terms of accounting is very favorable, but does that have any other impact that we don't know about?
Not really. It's really that, one, we don't have to fund in the future. If you have a annual required contribution or an ARC, which is typically done as a percent of payroll, our ARC was about 20%. We had really no ability to fund that. And that's, as that liability grew, we were just sticking our head in the sand, basically. So while there wasn't any cash, and we're not actually going to have cash in our pocket, there's tremendous savings on the balance sheet per not having to ever fund that. So it's an avoided cost.
Great. And then one last question about that and GASB 75. What will be the estimated impact to the city's net position when that pronouncement goes through?
Well, we'll have to book the $21 million, or however that's parsed out, to the various funds. At this point, I couldn't tell you what that division is.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Showalter, morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is David Showalter with Vavernick Tryon Day, the external auditors for the city of Glendale. And what I pass out to you is just a brief presentation of the results of the audit for June 30th, 2016. Some of the topics that are included in this presentation line up with the item that you have in front of you, which is our required communications letter, which is a 3-page letter. So we'll cover a lot of those topics within the presentation. So the second slide, I guess, talks about our required communications with respect to auditing the city of Glendale. So I'll cover some of these responsibilities that we have. Includes considering internal control to the extent necessary to design an effective and efficient audit approach, not for the purpose of providing assurance on internal control. As Shujin mentioned to you, that we did come out early in the year to take a look at internal controls. That time frame is around the May time frame where we come out and we meet with the various departments. We go through and update our understanding of internal controls as it relates to financial reporting. Areas such as expenditure transactions, revenue transactions, payroll transactions, getting an understanding of how those transactions are initiated, processed, and approved within those various departments, and then how all that information ultimately comes back into the financial statements at the end of the year. And then we design and implement our audit procedures based on our understanding of the city of Glendale to gain reasonable, not absolute, assurance as to the absence of material misstatements in the financial statements. So the whole point of us understanding the internal controls is to identify where there's areas of risk. So those areas of risk in internal controls could point to risk of material misstatement in the financial statements. So based on the results of our initial procedures, then we'll design the audit procedures to address any areas that we identify that we feel we need to spend more time on in the final phase of the audit. And when we come back out in the final phase of the audit, which is around October, that's where we perform our final procedures. And this is really where we're auditing the balance sheet, the income statement, the cash flows of the financial statements, and confirming balances, vouching balances, performing analytical procedures. So doing really the substantive testing of the financial statements. And then we're also reviewing the financial statement disclosures, making sure all the disclosures are appropriate, and then any new accounting pronouncements that are required to be implemented during the year, making sure that those pronouncements are properly implemented. And then next, we perform tests of compliance with certain provisions of laws and regulations, non-compliance with which could have a direct and material effect on the determination of financial statement amounts. So certain things like investment policy compliance, debt compliance, budget compliance, those are things that could have a material effect on the financial statements if they're not done properly. So we design our audit procedures to ensure that we understand what those compliance requirements are, and then design procedures to make sure that the city has internal controls and policies and procedures in place to follow those compliance requirements. And then for the single audit, our responsibility is to express an opinion as to whether the city is in compliance with each of the major federal programs that we audited. And then ultimately, we opine on the financial statements based on our audit. And then one last item here is that, as Shujin mentioned, there's a management discussion analysis that's included in the financial statements. That's kind of that executive summary that she mentioned. We read that information, but we don't opine on it. That's management's information only. The next slide gives you an overview of the results of the audit. So with the city's comprehensive annual financial report, or CAFR, we issued an unmodified opinion. Would be a clean opinion. And when it says with the emphasis in matter, the emphasis in matter was just noting the fact that there were two new accounting principles that were adopted during the year, GASB 72 and GASB 82. For the electric and water funds, we also issued unmodified or clean opinions. Those two had emphasis in matter related to the new accounting pronouncements. And then there's also just emphasis in matter relating to the fact that those financial statements do not present the full presentation to the city. So that when somebody picks up the financial statements and they see Glendale Water and Power, they shouldn't be confused with the Glendale annual financial report audit. And then the single audit was an unmodified opinion. There was the JPA audit that we do is an unmodified opinion. And then we also do a GAN limit, agreed upon procedures, and the NTD agreed upon procedures. And those we issue separate reports with our procedures and our findings included. The next slide. So this is where we're hitting on the topics of the required communications letter. So we cover the significant accounting policies and communicate those to you. The significant accounting policies are described in Note 1 to the financial statements. With respect to the June 30, 2016 audit, there were no changes in accounting policies that the city had. There were two new accounting pronouncements that were implemented, GASB 72 and GASB 82. GASB 72 deals with fair value measurement and reporting. And GASB 82 redefines certain pension items. So going back to GASB 68, where the city implemented the new pension accounting standards, the GASB has subsequently been issuing, I guess, amendments to those standards. And GASB 82 was another amendment, just redefining what covered employee payroll is versus what covered payroll is. These are just disclosure items that need to go into the financial statements. And so for that particular item, the definition of what a covered employee or what covered payroll is changed from pensionable earnings it changed from total earnings of the employee who gets a pension to just the pensionable earnings that employee gets who's in the pension. So it kind of reduced the amount that had to be disclosed in the financial statements. It was a very minor change. And then GASB 72 was dealing with fair value measurement, and the city was required to present an additional schedule in its cash and investment footnote, just outlining how it determines fair value for each of its investments. The next bullet is management's judgments and accounting estimates. So as part of our audit, we obtain an understanding of the accounting estimates that are embedded in the financial statements, things such as the IBNR or your claims judgments liability, your pension liability, as well as the allowance for doubtful accounts, depreciation of capital assets. All of those are based on accounting estimates. Either the city makes those judgments or the city hires specialists to provide judgments or help them with those judgments, whether it's an actuary or a specialist. So our responsibility is to understand those estimates and to audit those estimates and make sure that they're fairly stated in all material respects. Slide 5, we talk about sensitive disclosures. Sensitive disclosures that we pointed out deal with just the net pension liability again, just because of the sensitivity of the balance and the fact that the discount rate at this point is 7.5%, or 7.65%, and is actually on its way downward by CalPERS. So this disclosure basically will give you a pro forma on Note 9 as to whether the discount rate went up 1% or goes down 1%. What impact does that have on the net pension liability overall? That difference, if it did go down to 6 and 6.65%, is a material difference. So that's why we're noting that here. We had no disagreements or difficulties with management, we're pleased to say. And Management did not consult with any other accountants. On slide 6, we did not have any other audit findings or issues that we need to bring to your attention. And management signed the representation letter on November 28, 2016. On slide 7, as far as significant deficiencies and internal control and compliance findings, we do not have anything to report for this year's audit, and there were no items to report from the prior year audit. And then the next few slides are just new accounting principles that are going to be applicable in the coming years. Shujin covered GASB 75 for you in pretty good detail. GASB 74 deals with the OPEB plan if you actually administered a trust. So the city does not have a trust that they use to administer the OPEB plan, so that statement is not going to be applicable. Going to the next slide, number 9, GASB 77 deals with tax abatement disclosures. So if the city has any tax sharing agreements or tax abatement agreements that they have with taxpayers in order to basically draw maybe businesses into the city and wants to provide them with a benefit of some way, maybe sharing a tax or recouping some of their taxes. Some of those agreements may need to be disclosed in the financial statement. So this disclosure is really targeting those types of agreements. GASB 78 deals with pensions provided through certain multiple employer defined benefit pension plans. I don't think this is going to impact the city. An example of this would be if the city had a bargaining agreement with maybe a Teamsters union, and Teamsters requires you to deposit a certain amount of money maybe into a pension plan. That's more like a commercial pension plan. The city doesn't have any reporting requirements for those types of pension plans to disclose in their financial statements. So this statement was just basically clarifying that. GASB 81 deals with irrevocable split interest agreements. This is more applicable to a college or a university, not applicable to the city. And then GASB 83 deals with certain asset retirement obligations. So this standard is basically requiring that if the city has a legal obligation, when an asset basically fulfills its useful life, and at the end of its useful life there is a decommissioning responsibility that the city has, a legal obligation to do that, then the city would need to identify that liability and start recording that liability as soon as it's measurable. And then that liability would be on the face of the financial statements along with a deferral, deferred inflow or outflow, a deferred outflow. And then as that asset basically depreciates and then until it's finally needs to be placed out of service, and if there's any decommissioning that's required legally, then that liability would be measured and then recorded. Things like, if you had the examples that they use in the standard would be like a nuclear power plant. If you had a nuclear power plant, you need to somehow dispose of all that waste. And so that's a known obligation that you're going to have to do at some point. You need to record that liability at some point. So,
Do we have one of those?
Do we,
there's only one left in California that's active, yeah.
do we have any responsibilities in this area because we have a percentage of something in Arizona, something in Utah, some of our power plants that we might have a percentage ownership in?
Well, the city has kind of an ownership interest in a JPA that has ownership in those entities, so that would be something that JPA more than likely would have the liability, and then passing some of the cost on to the members may not be a pass through of the liability, but it'd be a pass through of some of the expenses that are associated with that. Yeah. And then I don't know if you have a copy of the financial statements in front of you, but the audit opinion, which is on page 1 of the financial report, that's where audit opinion is located. And the top of page 2 is where the audit opinion is. So if you go to page 2 of that report, right there. Yep. And it's the numeral 2. So if you actually open the financial section tab, if you look at financial section tab, and there it is, right there. And then top of page 2 is really the opinion paragraph that describes the fact that we audited the financial statements. There are multiple financial statements, as Shujin mentioned in her presentation. There's governmental activities financial statement, there's a business type activities financial statements, and then there's all the major funds that we audit. Each one of those actually has a separate opinion associated with it. So there's almost like multiple financial statements that are included in your CAFR, kind of on a consolidated basis. So we opine on each one of those financial statements, and So basically, in our opinion, the financial statements referred to above present fairly in all material respects the respective financial position of each of those financial statements of the city as of June 30, 2016, and of course, their respective changes in financial position and cash flows thereof. So all that means is that we have an unmodified or a clean audit report. So we're pleased to say. And I think that pretty much concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I can take those for you.
Quick question on going back to GASB 78. Would what we do with Verdugo Dispatch impact in this? Because Verdugo Dispatch is over on Columbia as part of the fire department, but it's a dispatch service that goes from Burbank all the way out to all the other communities that have part of that dispatch for fire and ambulance service and the rest.
So GASB 78, just to clarify, is pensions provided through certain multiple employer. Okay, so what's the specific?
My question is, does Verdugo Dispatch come into that area?
Verdugo Dispatch is a city department within our fire department. So whatever liability we may have, it would parse down to Verdugo, which operates as an enterprise fund. So yes, there would be a slight impact to Verdugo. Those costs would then be in turn charged out to the member agencies that we provide the service for.
Thank you.
I have a question about the the percentage of government grants. I was looking, excuse me, in the financial tab here that we're referring to, financial section, on page 10, the graph at the bottom. There's a pie chart with different revenues, although it seems like it's by source, and there's about 12% operating grants and contributions and about 1.7 capital grants and contributions. It says other increases by source, so I'm not sure if it's the sort of total of the different government grants or just the increase of each of those different grants. But I was trying to find out exactly how much the percentage of government grants as a function of our total revenues.
Yeah, it looks like this pie chart is basically parsing out. So this is actually the percentage that revenue source makes up of the overall revenues.
Okay, so that's it.
So the operating grants and contributions and capital grants, if you combine those, about 13.7%. Yeah. From a federal granting perspective, there's a smaller percentage that's federal, because you also have some that's state or local grants that come in from different sources. And I think the single audit this year was around, when you look at the CFA, it was around $80 million in total expenditures, but there's about $40 million of loans that are included in that number. So the number is really around $40 million on an annual basis, an expenditure-based basis, about $40 million of revenues that the city gets. That's federal-based, and that's what we audit when we conduct a single audit. That portion of the revenue. So.
So sure, Walter, I have a question regarding sensitive disclosures, and I know that we have talked about this in the past, at least once before I remember. You mentioned that, for example, the discount rate right now is 7.65, and you mentioned that it is going down.
Yes.
Which means that the liability will increase, right? So overall, if you look at it that way. Is there any acceptable practice across, municipalities that at least you know of, that, like, for example, they engage in some sort of sensitivity analysis, something that gives us, like, okay, this is the most likely scenario, this is, do you know of, because, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, well, the ultimate goal of these financial statements and these reviews is to give us a clear picture. And if we are dealing with something so sensitive in terms of, like, throwing off numbers by huge, like many, many millions of dollars, is there anything that we can do or the city can do as to give us a better picture?
I have other agencies that are hiring actuarials to help them with different scenarios of whether or not maybe they wanted to contribute additional funding to CalPERS in order to reduce their liability. Basically, your options are to try to reduce that liability. And so the liability is pretty volatile because there's a lot of different factors that go into determining what the net pension liability is going to be at the end of the year. The investment rate of returns right now is probably the biggest piece that's impacting the liability. And I think that kind of information isn't currently disclosed in the financial statements to tell you what the investment rate of return is on the plan's assets. That isn't a required disclosure. But I can tell you that CalPERS in 2015 and 2016 did not have good rates of return. And the measurement of this liability is as of 2015. So 2016, they didn't have a very good rate of return on their plan assets. And so that loss, let's say, is going to be passed down to all the members in the plan. And again, the liability is more than likely going to be impacted by that again. So really the only way to really get a handle on the liability is to look at different funding options or look at contributing more funds to CalPERS if that's something that the city wishes to do. And an actuary can provide you with that analysis on what if our workforce goes from 1,000 to 900, or if it goes from 1,000 to 1,100, how does that impact our pension obligation because you have more people paying into the system? If our workforce, look at the age of your workforce and determine, okay, if we have an older workforce, then at some point they're all going to be retiring, and then you're going to have younger, individuals that are going to be in the workforce paying more into the plan actually under PEPRA. So there's a lot of different scenarios that go into the financing of the plan, and then so you can either have somebody help you with that, or hire an actuary who can help you with some of those assumptions and kind of determine where things might be over the next few years. So from a strategic perspective, those are things that some of my cities are starting to look into. I mean, it's because of the GASB 68, now you've got all this visibility. So now some of their boards and some of their committees are asking more questions, just like you guys are too. And that's starting to kind of get people interested in how can we address this on a long-term basis.
I mean, I have a follow-up question. I'm not sure if it's necessarily for you, but I'm just curious. For example, when different departments or different entities come back for renegotiating their contracts, and let's say, I remember last year, I think it was the Glendale Water and Power got a 4% increase on their contract, or what? I'm not sure if I'm using the correct term, but do you know if the city sees the impact on the pension as well, or that 4% also includes what's going to happen to the future pension obligations?
I can address that. Let me have you, if you have your CAFR, turn to page 81 and as well as page 77. There are two important tables in there, and 81 has the sensitivity analysis of the change in the discount rate. And if you have followed PERS, they recently changed their discount rate from 7.5, which is the net of expenses, but 7.5 down to 7.35, if I remember correctly, and then following year down to 7%. So you can see if those were to change, what the increase in liability, currently at the 765, we're approximately $430 million unfunded. If it were to go down 1% total, it would go up to 662, and if the rate of return went up, you can see the huge swings with those small percentages. As David noted, there are abilities to mitigate those risks that we have, and if you go to page 77, it shows you the various formulas that we have for our different bargaining groups. PEPRA is the Public Employee Pension Retirement Act, or Reform Act, that Governor Brown signed in, so you can see that there's lesser benefits for new employees as they come into the system. Classic are the old birds like me that have been in the system for a long, long time. But Glendale pays a percent for every employee, but the employee pays a portion, like you do with Social Security, a split. Okay. The employee pays, but what we have been able to do is negotiate, and you can see in that one column it says employees cost sharing, and we've been able to have cost sharing amounts where the employees are actually paying a portion of the city's rate, basically a give back, and you can see it's as high as 3.75%, which compared to most cities, I can tell you most cities pay the employee portion, or have been historically. They're just now starting to get the employee to pay the employee portion. We've done that, and we've gone a step beyond in having the employee paying part of the city rate as well. And lastly, other alternatives, as David mentioned, we could make additional contributions to PERS. You can make early payments on an annual basis, which we have done if it's beneficial to what we would get back. They give you a significant discount for an early payment. Then you just have to write about a $25 million check in July and then see how it goes. The other alternative is creating a Section 115 trust, which we are contemplating doing. We talked about it a little bit with council at the when we delivered the CAFR and did the first quarter update back in November. That basically is we set up a secondary pension reserve trust. We put money in there, we let it marinate for 8 to 10 years, and then draw down in the future when we know our rates are going up. We have gotten a number of scenarios from our contract actuary, John Bartel, and we've looked at the projections of where those rates are going to be over a 30-year horizon. They're going to be significantly high. We know that it could be higher or more or less depending, as actuaries have. There's a lot of gears in that machine. It's not just return on PERS, but the age of your workforce, the volume of your workforce. We have cut a significant number over the years, so that reduces the amount of bodies that we're actually contributing for, which would raise the rates. There's a lot of moving pieces in that puzzle, but we have looked at doing an exterior 115 pension rate stabilization trust, and we'll probably take that back to council very soon.
Just a quick follow-up question on that. You said it was pension 115 or?
It's a Section 115
Section
and
one.
basically tax exempt for purposes of a pension.
This is not something that is managed by CalPERS, or is not?
Correct.
Okay.
We go to a third-party management, so we can control the funds and withdraw the funds. It just doesn't go into the big bucket of PERS.
Okay. Thank you.
And if I
This
can
really
make,
helps. Thank you so
and
much.
if I can make a comment on that, the GASB is actually deliberating on how to account for those trust funds in the financial statements as we speak. So
They're fairly new,
So they actually have that on their agenda, and they're working through that because we have a lot of agencies, especially in California, that are looking into those types of plans in order to help mitigate some of the long-term effects of the rising rates. And so they do want to have those assets set aside now, and there might be a windfall of revenues that came in, and they want to take the advantage of maybe putting those aside now so that they have those assets in the future in order to mitigate those future rate increases. So that is something that we're seeing a lot of other agencies look into as well.
Am I correct that when you talk about the percentage of the city rate the employee is paying, this would change when you're renegotiating with a new MOU?
no, the member rate is set by PERS.
By PERS? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Ms. Scholl.
Thank you.
Okay, item number 7.
Number 7 is audit committee or staff comments.
I have a comment. First of all, thank you very much to the staff, and thank you to Mr. Showalter and Bavernick, Trine, and Day. I know that printing this beautiful book and preparing it and going over it is a huge undertaking, and it will provide me many hours of very interesting reading. And so,
Time, I'm sure.
well, I mean, we need sleep aids.
Exactly.
So thank you for that. I would like to bring up our next meeting. Our next meeting's scheduled on April 24th. And April 24th, even though the city is open that day, I'd like to entertain rescheduling that meeting, please. And so we can call for I can call for a special meeting, but I wanted to bring it up here, and that way we can maybe just go ahead and do that as a committee. Any objections to us changing the day of that meeting?
Are we talking about backing it up to the 17th or moving it into May 1st? Because if we go forward a week, we're out of April altogether.
Your choices are May 1st, May 8th,
May 1st, May 8th?
or May 15th if you want to have it on Monday.
What's the availability of this room on other days other than Monday?
I don't know that we can comment on that as we sit here. We can certainly check on it, but it is a Monday morning at 8 a.m., so the likelihood that it would be available is great. So if we were to select a date and it doesn't work, we can work out a different date with the chair at a later time.
So how about we do this? If there are no objections to actually changing the date of the meeting, then what I'll do is I will communicate with staff and come up with a date or two, and then that can be communicated, and then we can deal with that offline.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any staff comments? Okay, next item.
Next item is new business.
Okay, seeing no new business, next item.
Actually,
Oh,
question. Since we bandied about having an actuary, is this something that people are looking into? Is this something that we would formally request the finance department to look into and get back to us? Or is this?
We have Mr. Chair, members of the committee, we have an actuary on contract.
Oh, okay.
So we use him frequently for various scenarios, so it's an ongoing thing. We
Then,
have him provide us a lot of data every year.
then the question's redundant. Never mind. Thank you.
okay, adjournment. Do I have a motion?
I move.
And second. So, any second?
I'll second.
Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.